Morning, everybody. My name is Ravi Velloor. I work for the Straits Times. A big pleasure to be here today in this gathering of some of the finest minds in India. I'm here with three people. Sam Pitroda, whom I first met in 1986 at the 7th floor of Akbar Bhawan when he just set up C. And on the day I met him, he was not in a good mood because a carpenter had come into his office and done some work and left the shavings on the floor. And Sam said, "Who's going to clean it up?" And that guy said, "That's not my job. I did my job over there. Somebody else will do this." So he was a bit puzzled, having just come back from the United States. I'm not going to reintroduce Sam because it's a waste of time. So let me talk about Shyam Srinivasan. Shyam is the MD and CEO of the Federal Bank. That's a major private bank, a regional bank in my home state of Kerala. Shyam became CEO in September 2010, and he came to Federal Bank after about 20 years in other banks, including Standard Chartered and Citi. He is an alumnus of the IIM in Calcutta and the REC in Trichy. Then we have Mr. Yeoh. Casey is the managing director of the Singapore EDB, Economic Development Board. For a few of you who may not be familiar with EDB, EDB is the body that built Singapore. He is an EDB lifer, worked there all his life. In Singapore, we have this system of scholars, and he's a scholar picked up early. You got a Glaxo EDB fellowship. You went to Imperial College, London, for a chemical engineering degree, and you have an MBA from Stanford. So these are our panelists, and I suggest that they spend about 5 to 8 minutes talking on this theme of reimagining Singapore, India. As the guest and possibly only non-Indian here, Casey, would you like to start?
Sure, yeah, happy to do so. Thank you, Ravi. And good morning, everyone, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak this morning, and warm welcome to those who have traveled from outside of Singapore to join us. I thought I would start off by actually talking about Singapore's economic history, given that we had, well, firstly, we have a very short history, only 51 years, and last year we celebrated 50 years of independence. It's been quite, I suppose, instructive in a way to examine how Singapore developed, because we have to understand where we came from to determine how best we should move forward. In the 1965, when Singapore first gained independence, I would say there are broadly maybe 5 phases of economic strategy or growth in Singapore's history. The first phase was in the 60s, where unemployment was high, 14.5%. The British had just pulled out. They were talking about withdrawing from the maritime sector as well. And our approach then was really one of trying to solve the high unemployment problem. So from an economic development perspective, we decided to approach it from promoting and encouraging labor-intensive activities. So that phase was about import substitution. At the end of that decade, we started looking at more promoting of multinationals as well. But you could imagine that we were promoting any activity that basically could create large numbers of jobs. So for instance, one of the activities was to assemble transistors for black and white television sets. Now, nobody watches black and white television sets anymore, and we don't do those activities in Singapore anymore either. The second phase, having that base and solve the immediate problem, was to move into skills intensive. And skills intensive because they would then allow Singaporeans to move up the wage curve and generate better remuneration and compensation. Interestingly, and you will see this throughout the economic development history, we had very strong partnerships with a number of multinational companies, one of which was Tata, to set up a joint training center supported by the government to enable and equip Singaporeans with the right skill sets for the industries that we were in. The other two companies were Philips and Rolei, and there was a very strong focus on precision engineering at that point in time. Now then we moved on to the third decade, which was the 80s. And in the 80s, Singapore was hit with its first post-independence recession. We said that we should have, therefore, industries that are much more anchored in Singapore. And we moved into a phase of capital intensive. So capital intensive investments such as the petrochemicals, the chemicals investments, such as semiconductors, multi-billion dollar facilities. In the 80s, we had a joint venture between a Japanese consortium led by Sumitomo Chemical together with the Singapore government to set up our first petrochemicals complex, which built on a base of refining activities that Singapore had promoted. Today, we are one of the top 3 refining centers in the world, together with the likes of Houston and Rotterdam, and all this despite not having any oil of our own. So that was that phase of capital intensive. And in the fourth decade, then we looked at diversifying even further beyond manufacturing and said we needed services as another engine of our economy. We promoted services, well, those that are associated with manufacturing, such as logistics, supply chain management, but also services in areas of education services, which was not directly related, infocoms and media services. And then in the fifth decade, we started looking at knowledge-intensive activities. Right. So knowledge-intensive activities would include well, professional services, legal services, the visual arts, visual effects, digital animation sectors. And all of that led us pretty much to current day, 5 decades of economic growth. When we started, Singapore's unemployment rate was 14.5%. GDP per capita was about $300. Today, our unemployment is about 2%, which is probably for all intents and purposes 0. Yeah. And our GDP per capita is about 55,000 US dollars. So you could argue, thank you very much. But you could argue that we have seen a fair degree of success, but I think we can't afford to sit on our laurels and just coast. The next decade, we think, will be characterized by really significant levels of technology improvements and development. It will be characterized by the growth of the Asian consumer base and a great degree of urbanization. And all of those, I think, will give us both challenges as well as opportunities. And if I were to attempt to say the next phase of Singapore's economic development, what would it be? It would likely be innovation intensive. We will shift from value adding to value creating. And hopefully Singapore, even with a small market base, but against the backdrop of the 625 million people in Southeast Asia, hopefully we can connect to the 1.3 billion in India, 1.3 billion in China. That will be that location from which companies can develop new businesses, new models, new products, services, and solutions, and grow that from Singapore to access the region. I'm happy to elaborate further on that subsequently, but I thought maybe I'll just stop there and that sets the stage for the subsequent discussion. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. That was wonderful. It's been a tremendous growth story, and many of us are fortunate to have been part of that story as well. You know, Shyam.
Thank you. Good morning. We heard Sam speak. We had Nandan speak, and there were some similarities and some distinctly different thoughts. So one has worked for many years with the government, other from a private sector, went into government, came out. So he brought his perspective. I don't have any direct linkages with government, so mine is a very grounds up input. I'd share 3 points. Firstly, when you heard all the speakers, you often believe that everything that can be said of India is true, and the opposite is also equally true. You know, when we say that India has the fastest growing GDP, it is true. But relative to its potential, it's growing below potential. And I think in the context of reimagining India-Singapore, from what I heard Mr. Casey speak, the things that India can take away from this reimagining opportunity and should look at, first we need to look at India in the context of what is happening today. What is called famously the MRT, the Modi Rajan Technology Initiative, so to say. At one end, the government under Modi is looking to do fairly durable, enduring stuff, but it's a painful transition, which in many ways Sam spoke about the things that India needs to be investing into. Equally, on the financial sector side, the reforms that the Governor Rajan is trying to do is quite profound, but equally painful in the short duration. But alongside is the magnificent and striking improvements that is happening on the technology side. So the Modi-Rajan technology triangle, if you will, is in the context of what India is often referred to as the three-speed economy. If you break the GDP, about 40% of it is actually a low-speed economy. It's really dragging the country, and largely because of some exogenous factors, but equally by the fact that things like construction, agriculture, infrastructure, public transportation, public administration is going through both challenges and some profound changes. So I think that is a drag in the wider context of what the country is. Then the mid-speed economy is sort of middling along, and that's about 30% of the GDP. And another 30% of the GDP, which is really largely technology-led, is getting funding from private equity, from venture capital, and that is really growing at a rapid clip. So what is dragging India is the infrastructure, the commercial and the public administration related stuff. And I think that's where the India-Singapore opportunity could be quite compelling if there are meaningful ways of working together, which already exists, but I think needs to take scale. And there you could draw on things that Nandan spoke about, Sam spoke about skilling, about leveraging the technology, about bringing in or leveraging the India stack, the fact that 1 billion people have Aadhaar now. So there's some profound opportunities. But even more importantly, Singapore being a magnet for capital, Singapore being an opportunity which, like you spoke, is small in population but has a huge universe to cater to. And I think the infra needs of India, I mean, nobody here needs to be introduced to those challenges, but I think that can be the largest opportunity in our lifetime that can make a meaningful impact. As all of us know, the Indian market, the financial services market in India currently is going through some significant challenges, but importantly, the growth of infrastructure in India, there's no direct funding, there's no corporate bond market in India. So to develop such a market, you need markets like Singapore, which can be the intermediary where money comes in and then flows back to India. So I think structurally, there are a lot of things that is happening in India which can be enduring, can be durable, but more importantly, the infrastructure that needs to be created has to be both competed for but also collaborated with markets like Singapore, which can be something that is special and then build onto it. So I'll sort of pause here and then come back later.
Thank you, Shyam. As you know, Casey also hinted at two things that Singapore believes in, that is inclusion and tripartisan, which was, he didn't specifically talk about it, but it was inherent in his address. Sam, what do you?
Thank you. First time I came to Singapore was 1975. And I have seen Singapore change from an outside. A visitor who would come once in a while and see a whole new place emerge every visit. And that transformation has been remarkable over a period of last 40 years almost. From this, if I was to take one message for India, it would be all about urbanization. Urbanization. So when people in India talk about cleaning India, I would turn that to Singapore, saying, help me clean India. As an example, okay? Because it's a very clean place. They know something. When I look at Kanpur, I wonder why we can't keep our cities clean. So it's like going to Singapore and say, help us design a strategy to clean. Because cleaning India is not about taking a jhadu and showing on TV that you are cleaning. I did my own calculation. Cleaning India requires 300,000 crore investment in machinery, training, logistics, support, landfill, all of that. Nobody talks about that. So you see three actors taking jhadu, showing them, and everybody say, great, cleaning India. Come on. Get real. So this is one area where you can really get real. It's a very complex task. Cleaning India should be a priority. I'm delighted that we have taken that sort of task, but then it has become a sort of, soundbite and slogan. Where is the plan? Who is doing it? How is it going to be done? Show me a blueprint. Nothing happens. So I would very seriously look at this as one activity that we could work with Singapore on a long-term basis. Second activity is Singapore has done very well in going vertical. Every time you come here, you see more verticals. I have said this for last 25, 30 years, that New York is what New York is because it is vertical. There is a difference between New York and Los Angeles in economy, in growth, in institutions, in health services. You need to go vertical in India. But we are preventing going vertical, FSI, this, that. There isn't enough land to go horizontal. I would rather see pockets of verticals connected than horizontal, go 100 miles. Today, traffic in Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, Hyderabad takes 2 hours. I was in Bangalore once, took me 3.5 hours to get to airport. Now, what kind of city is that? Okay. People have accepted this as a norm. Doesn't have to be. So can we work with Singapore on going vertical? Along with that going vertical comes all the city services. Drainage, to parking, to water, to electricity, to everything else. We talk about 100 smart cities in India. But what about 1,000 cities which are dumb? Let's work on those cities. But you see, in India, people talk about all this stuff. They don't know what the hell they're talking about. Okay? And I know all the smart city guys who are working on smart city. They have no idea. Okay? But nobody wants to say that. So I think I would work more on taking existing cities and not necessarily making them smart or anything, because there is no such thing as smart. I want a happy city. I don't want smart city. I want a happy city. Okay. Can we work with Singapore to make our cities happy? Environmental concerns. 3 years ago, when I was here, I had a dinner with Prime Minister's wife. And we spent about 2 hours, two of us, talking. And I asked her a question. I said, what is next in Singapore? You got everything, essentially. Tall buildings, good income, everything clean, everything works. Maybe it's small, one can argue, but it works. What is big idea next? I was very impressed. She said, Sam, we would like to reduce temperature in Singapore by 4 degrees centigrade. Now, that's a big idea. Okay. You need that kind of a vision. Okay. It may take 10 years. Okay. So I think we have a lot to learn from Singapore. We can always say Singapore is too small, we are too big, blah, blah, blah. It's okay. Those are realities of life. Okay. How do we really take these two ideas and move forward to Today I'm told we are working with Singapore government on 100 new smart cities. Those are green fields. It'll take 20 years to acquire land. Okay, it takes another 20 years to build it. Okay. It's one thing to build a green field. It's another thing to go into the existing cities and make it comfortable, happy. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. You know, I listened to your speech very carefully, and I was a bit surprised.
One thing, I can't hear you here.
The
It's an echo.
There is some problem.
There's an
If
echo.
they can fix it, I would like it, because I can't hear. Maybe I'm old.
no, even I can't.
Huh? It's some echo.
There is an echo. Yeah.
Yeah.
Your voice, I think, goes through the
Yeah,
audience.
so I sort of guess what you are saying, but I don't know what you're saying.
That'll be awful.
Maybe Ravi, if you stood there, we could hear.
Maybe, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Sam, you know, I listened to your speech very carefully, and there was one issue that I didn't hear you mention, although you were a part of the mission on that, and that's an area in which Singapore does very well, that is water.
Absolutely. Big.
Every state in India, except Gujarat, the water table is falling.
Oh, in Gujarat, you go to Saurashtra, which is part of Gujarat.
Yes.
It is a mess.
Saurashtra, yes, but generally the water table is all right in Gujarat. They get it right here, and with your influence, you might want to press that a little bit back home in India.
But they also get their water. You have some arrangement with Malaysia on water, right?
Well, there is that arrangement, but today Singapore is self-sufficient. It can do without the Malaysian water supply.
We have a plan for self-sufficiency.
Yes,
Right.
it's almost there, yeah. It's very serious.
That's correct.
Casey, I'd like to ask you this. You know, when I got here in '93,
Yeah.
somebody who held your office, Philip Yeoh, had just gone to Bangalore. And he came back and laid the seeds of the Bangalore IT Park. And today, the Bangalore IT Park was the sort of a template, a benchmark for quality infrastructure in India. And Singapore built office spaces now spread like a rash across India. If you plot it on a map, you'd be shocked. I mean, they're everywhere. Where do you think Singapore should go next when it comes to India? And what are you looking at?
Maybe, Ravi, if your indulgence, I could speak a little bit about the water, because
Yeah, sure.
it came up as a consideration. And the background here is that Singapore started out, well, we were certainly part of Malaysia, and we had 2 water agreements to purchase water from Malaysia, because we didn't imagine that we could be self-sufficient in water. Now, I think the lesson for us learned is that you should never be too reliant on your neighbors for anything, regardless of the relationship. And in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, we decided that perhaps we should have a concerted effort and a focus to determine whether we could indeed be self-sufficient in water. To give you that background, about 20% of our water comes from our natural water catchment. We bought about 50% of our water from Malaysia, and then we had another 30% from water reclamation. And we issued a technology challenge, and we said that any company that can reduce the energy cost for desalination by half from what was the gold standard at that point in time, we would fund them to do that work in Singapore. They would own the intellectual property, and we would want them to grow that business from Singapore. So Siemens won that bid. They developed a new technology, which is now being tested out in one of our plants. Right now, we probably have about 30% of our water coming from desal, and maybe about 30–40% from reclamation. By 2061, we anticipate that if we wanted to, 50% of our water can come from reclamation, which is recycling, 30% from desal, and 20% from our own water catchment. 2061 is a very important date, because it's the date when our second contract with Malaysia expires. And that's the reason why we have a 50-year plan for water independence. And we had already chosen not to renew the first contract when it expired in 2011. So that's, I think, a strong signal. But as a consequence of that, today we have 150 water companies doing research and development work in Singapore. Our very own Singaporean company, Flux, has gone on to build the world's largest desalination plant in Algeria, and it's really allowed us to seed and catalyze a new industry.
Yep.
So that's an example, illustration of the water story, which I thought is interesting.
Yeah.
Now, your question, Ravi, about what next?
Yes, what next?
For our partnership. Firstly, I should say we have a good, certainly, relationship and economic partnership with India. I think India's first free trade agreement outside was actually signed with Singapore. Yeah. And as we look ahead, quite rightly you said the Bangalore IT Park was probably one of the first concrete examples of how we had grown. And at a point in time, we were thinking of how could our relationship with multinationals, a lot of strong investors, very comfortable with Singapore, how could that extend to other parts of the region? We had an IT park in Bangalore, we had investments in Suzhou with China, we had Vietnam, and we had closer to home, Indonesia. I think certainly the next phase is notwithstanding what Sam said about the 100 smart cities, I think our interest would be an opportunity to look at developing cities. Because Singapore itself is, we believe, a good showcase, a model city. And can we work with you? I think we've made a master plan for Andhra Pradesh's new capital.
Amravati.
Yes, and then looking ahead. But I fully agree with what Sam just mentioned, which is not about greenfield, but it's about retrofitting. Because people, in many cases, do not start from ground zero and then start to build. And many of the challenges today that cities face is with existing congestion, with the sprawl that you have. So I think that's an economic opportunity that we can perhaps use Singapore, some of the solutions that has worked well to be able to export that.
Yeah. Casey, thank you very much. You know, you charted in your presentation, you know, Singapore's growth story, so to speak. You know, there was Hewlett-Packard, there was DuPont. Then you went into chip manufacture. I mean, you invited Seagate. Then you tried your own, which was Chartered Semiconductor, which is probably not a great success story. Pharmaceuticals, and now Rolls-Royce is going to make its engines, A380 engines in Singapore. I mean, it's come a long way. That's right. You know that Prime Minister Modi is talking about this Make in India. Sam was a bit negative about it for good reasons, I assume. Now, this essentially means lengthening the supply chain in India, or you want to call it onshoring. That's another word you could use. Yeah. Given your experience, you know, given EDB's experience in Singapore, what do you think he needs to do to get this right?
Okay. Well, I think firstly, we are strong proponents of manufacturing. Yeah. It comprises about 20% of Singapore's GDP, employs 500,000 people. Now, out of 5.5 million, that's not insignificant. And it's, it has to be internationally competitive because there's no way you can make something and sell it outside. We do not have the benefit of a 1.3 billion market like India, so it has to be internationally competitive. But the manufacturing sector of today is very different from what started in Singapore in the 60s or in the 70s, and we have evolved. Now, you pointed out to these drives. In the 80s, Singapore had a 60% market share of assembly for hard disk drives. Now, as the activities became more and more commoditized, companies naturally moved out and gravitated to lower cost locations. But today, we have a 40% market share for hard disk media, which is at the component level, the higher value part of the disk drives. So I would argue that we have actually been able to evolve alongside building on the industry strengths that we have. I think it creates good jobs, but the necessary precursor, unlike services, is infrastructure. Because you're talking about moving products, you're moving goods, you either have to bring in the raw materials and you have to ship them out, you have to get them to the end markets. I had the opportunity to visit India again recently. I've probably made about 15 trips in the past to India over the last 15 years or so. And this is the first time I actually visited Gujarat. And I was very struck by the difference in terms of the infrastructure that they have there compared to the cities which I've been more familiar with, the likes of Mumbai and Delhi. And I visited two facilities there actually, a textile plant and a car making facility. These are activities that I would never typically visit because in Singapore we just don't have the labor to support such activities. And I was very impressed with the level of technology that they've adopted. And it occurred to me that, well, India is such a vast country. It has states, regions with different strengths, and to capitalize on those to grow a manufacturing sector would seem indeed sensible and doable.
Thank you, Casey. That very useful response. I'm going to change the subject a little bit and bring in a gender issue. And Shyam, this is targeted at you. Christine Lagarde of the IMF has been pushing this for India, saying that you have to bring in more women into the workforce, and then your growth will tick up. 1 or 2 percentage points she expects can go up. But if you look at the statistics in India, women's participation in the workforce has actually dropped in the last 4 or 5 years, which may not be such a good thing. What do you say to that, Shyam? And do you have trouble hiring good people, good women for your bank? Is it something that can be done? And what do we need to get that right? And Casey, if you could tell us from the Singapore experience, Singapore started encouraging women to come into the workforce in the 70s in a significant way, and that's why we have this maid policy, you know, so that the caregivers at home. Has that worked, and are there any lessons that we in India could pick up from the Singapore experience in that? Shyam, you go first.
Firstly, if you'll allow me to be a little provocative on the point of India and not clean and learning from Singapore, that there is no doubt. But I must point out that little India is not as good as the rest of Singapore is. Right? So there is something more nascent or native issues that we need to address. It's not all of India is dirty or all of India is this. I think the issue is maybe more cultural, more experiential, more way we were brought up, and the economic development. So I think there is something that we should pick up from that, because that's, I didn't want to lose that point of, you know, every part of Singapore and every part of India is not equally good or bad. Coming to the other point of employing women, interestingly, the banking industry, or actually wider service industry, is finding more women joining the workforce. Now, I've been in Federal for almost coming up to 6 years. We've hired 5,000 people in the last close to 6 years. 3,500 are women. Right? That certainly it brings a certain degree of diversity, difference in thinking, and importantly, stability. The risk is mobility is little sort of hampered because they have other personal and family commitments, so the ability to sort of uproot themselves and move away becomes an issue. So actually, as an employer, the challenge is how do you make sure that you're able to accommodate the personal needs of all the employees. And I think that's something that we are discovering every now and then. We've come up with numerous programs, which I think we've borrowed from some parts of the West, some parts of what Singapore has done very successfully, and trying to make sure that the employees have an option to take a year sabbatical so that they don't lose out. When they come back to work, they are not, you know, sort of one notch below. That said, I think the fact that there are more women coming to employment in software, in banking, in other service industry is now, you know, there is no, at least to my mind, there isn't a striking either wage difference or choice difference. I think employers are more happy to employ. Yes, in industries that are more physically demanding, I think there's a struggle. Just as an example, we at the bank, we have something called a skill development initiative that we've put together. And the first batch just graduated a couple of weeks ago. It had 28 students. You'll be surprised. 13 of them were women. And you'll be even more surprised. The nature of the job that they chose to do was actually plumbing and carpenting. And they were graduate engineers or diploma holders from the local institutes, and they actually chose to become plumbing and carpenting, and 9 of them have been absorbed by Bosch, based in Bangalore. So it is, I think, below the surface, some very deeply transformative stuff is happening. The crucial choice in front of an employer is how do you make sure that the trade-off and the balance between the ability to help them or allow them to meet their personal family needs and yet be involved in all the corporate requirements is one thing that we are discovering, and I think that's an area we should try to learn more about.
Thank you, Shyam. Casey?
Okay. Well, I think for us, labor and especially talent is a very scarce resource in Singapore. We only have, well, 4 million actually Singaporeans and permanent residents. We want to make use of every single one. And I think we've been quite conscious about continuing to encourage and support women in the workforce. And well, I think we have been very successful. Maybe if I can illustrate through an example, in the early 2000s when the government decided to make a big push into research and development and innovation, we figured out that we actually lacked the PhD talent. And we set aside $1 billion with the aim of training 1,000 PhDs. If you do the sums, it means that every single one of this talent is worth to us an investment of $1 million. It's $1 million because we pay for the undergraduate all the way through to the postdoc. It's a 10-year commitment. We have funded more than 1,000 over of these scholarships to date. Every year, 30 to 40 people come back to Singapore from top universities all over the world, and they join the public sector in research and eventually move on to the private sector. I think more than half of these are women. So certainly not an issue there in terms of gender diversity and equality. But we, as you pointed out, Ravi, had to put in place the necessary support infrastructure to allow women with families to be able to take care of their children. The access to domestic helpers helps. It is certainly a great aid in Singapore. I would say maybe half jokingly that one of the consequences is that people decide to start families later, and that leads to perhaps it's a correlation to Singapore's low birth rate. We are now only at 1.2, and therefore way below replacement rate in Singapore in terms of being able to regenerate our population. Fortunately, Singapore is a fairly popular location. People do want to come in, so that's how we've been supplementing it. But that's one of the consequences.
Yeah, and some would say that there's a generation of Singaporeans raised by maids. Well, yeah. Sam, I'm going to ask you on your address. I mean, since this theme is about reimagining, I mean, you are responsible in so many ways for helping the country leapfrog, particularly the copper era into, the whole telecom thing. There are massive changes happening on the ground today in e-commerce. Today we are at a stage where, solar energy has got grid parity with coal, so to speak. These give us an opportunity for a clean way of growth. But you, after speaking about Gandhiji and all that, you also recommended that we should be like New York City. But a lot of the technologies that we're doing, yesterday I had Dr. Arjun Kalyanpur sitting with me. Arjun runs a company called Teleradiology. He, sitting in Bangalore, he reads X-rays for your home city, Chicago. Typically we always thought that urbanization is the way to go, but clearly we are not equipped to do that competently in India yet. Is there another way of growth? Why do we have to go urban? All these technologies help us to stay at home and maybe stay in the hinterland and get effective healthcare. Now retail is coming, it's being delivered to your door. So is there another way of looking at growth? Do you have a comment to that?
First of all, I'd like to make a little correction.
Yeah.
I'm not against or negative about made in India. No Indian could be against make in India.
I'm not saying against that, but the way it's going.
Because you know how our press is.
Sure.
With high profile, our press will blow it up out of proportion.
Okay.
So I just want to put it in perspective. Yeah. What I'm against is the fact that Made in India is not just about asking foreign companies to come to India to produce. It's about providing the right institutional infrastructure, power, water. If we do our work right, people will come. That's the point. But it is misunderstood. Mm-hmm. I can see headline tomorrow in the paper in India. I'll give you one example. Once at IIM in Calcutta, I was giving a convocation speech. And I was young then.
Yeah.
So in my speech, I said something about Gandhi, and then said, as far as I'm concerned, you could wear jeans, drink scotch, and still be Gandhian. Next day headline in the paper, Pitroda said, Gandhi wore gin and drank scotch.
I can tell you that will not happen in Singapore.
Okay. No, but there are people here from India. Okay, I'm not worried about,
He hasn't yet arrived here.
yeah, okay, but there may be some others, who knows? Anyway, so I totally forgot what we were talking about.
No, talking about Make in India.
No, there was some other question you had asked earlier.
Oh, yeah, about, is there,
Yeah, Gandhi, okay.
yeah.
There is nothing contradictory about being Gandhian and living in New York. Let's understand that. Gandhi does not necessarily mean rural, poor, not true. I don't understand why we don't understand Gandhi.
No, it's not
Yeah,
that.
no,
The question is, Gandhi said India lives in its villages. What I'm saying is that, is there another paradigm
Yeah, but I'm coming to
that does not require urbanization for
Give me a minute.
sustained growth? Yeah.
See, first of all, India already has huge urbanization, given. I'm not talking about more people coming to Bangalore or Bombay or Delhi. I'm talking about what exists in Delhi, Bangalore, Hyderabad. You know, you take Kerala, it's a one big continuum. Okay? How do we fix that? Is different issue than saying what do we do with rural India. If Bangalore can be the back office of America, why can't rural India be back office of urban India? Possible. Okay? But I think we have a challenge to fix urbanization. We have an equally big challenge to fix rural India. They both go hand in hand. It's not this or that. Okay? That's how I see it.
Thank you, Sam. I'm going to take a question that came up from the floor, and it's the most popular one here, and it says, how can we facilitate greater people-to-people connect between India and Singapore? I think you should take that, Casey. Just by way of background, I was surprised to hear that there are more than 400 flights a week that now connect Singapore and India. Yeah. It used to be in a few scores not too long ago.
Well, I think the physical connectivity certainly helps. And in many cases, I'm not sure if it's still the case, but people want to travel to other parts of the world would fly through Singapore. I suppose one of the benefits is to fly Singapore Airlines, which I think is a great airline. But at the people-to-people connection, conferences like this helps because it's basically about facilitating the partnerships and the relationship. We have more than 6,000 Indian companies with operations in Singapore. And I thought that one of the benefits is not just perhaps to connect with Singaporean companies or Singaporeans, although that's certainly a plus, but also to be able to engage the greater region. Because there are 5,000 Chinese companies here, there are 7,000 multinationals from US, Europe, and Japan, and there are more than 10,000 Southeast Asian companies in Singapore. Now, for a country 700 square kilometers, we probably have the highest density of companies. And this then allows us to facilitate and catalyze that interactions and networking and partnerships, which might not be possible elsewhere. And indeed, we have seen examples of Indonesian companies linking up with Indian companies, with Chinese companies. And we hope to be able to facilitate and do more of that.
Shyam, you want to comment on that?
Actually, I think Singapore, for an average and more affluent Indian, is not an unknown commodity, right? All of us at some stage want to be in Singapore, and I think it's testimony that there are so many Indians. I think the issue as the real grassroots work happens. You know, he pointed to Singapore being the support for cleaning India, for manufacturing in India, for the infrastructure work. I think as Singaporeans start seeing India the way Indians have seen Singapore, the connect will only deepen and further. But the point that Sam mentioned, he may remember in 2012, we had something called Emerging Kerala. Sam was then the advisor for Kerala. And I had the opportunity to be with him on a panel. And one of the things he spoke about is certainly his favorite pet theme of going vertical. And Kerala is landlocked, and there's a shortage of land. I think he brilliantly sort of brought out the opportunity for going vertical, both in agriculture and in manufacturing, if you remember, Sam. One of the things about urbanization and the fact that rural India can serve middle India, urban India, the bank that I am part of is a remarkable example. We live and work in Alua.
Absolutely.
We are not High Street, Main Street, Mumbai, Nariman Point, Churchgate.
Right.
I live and work in Alua. I serve over 6 million customers, over 1,300 branches across the country. Half of our employees are outside. So I think there are many examples of that happening. The company that makes blood bags that supply the whole world happens in a remote location in Trivandrum called Terumo Penpal. And they had a global relationship. So I think there are lots of such good examples. But what is happening is the point I'll connect the connecting people in today's world where social media is explosive is something that we all have to take it on ourselves, the little more aware citizenry, so to say, have to figure out how this can get amplified, because a lot of negativity will sort of fade off and the good news starts amplifying. One of the fears I always have is a lot of cynical negativity starts spreading, which we should, one of the things that groups like this should swear is to kill it. I think that will just, the media should play a significant part. In Kerala, media is quite, can be quite disastrous. So media plays a significant part, and I think if we learn a lesson from what you said, Straits Times or whoever, there's no negative news coming out.
No, I didn't say that. As I must be very clear that as foreign editor, now associate editor of the paper, I stress one thing, that we will always be critical, but never cynical. That's a very important distinction. Casey, you heard Nandan Nilekani, in his video presentation, and he was talking about innovations and new things coming in. The APIs, stacks, the India stack, various things. Singapore's been big on leveraging of innovation, not always your own, but the best in the world. Is other things that you're seeing in India that excite you and you want to see more of and want to get a part of? And Sam, are there things happening over there that Nandan didn't talk about that you could tell his audience?
Okay. Well, I think in the app space and the API space, certainly the movement on Startup India, I find is very exciting. And with a market of 1.3 billion people, you can actually do quite a lot that you cannot perhaps in a country the size of Singapore. What we would perhaps like to see is that channel of Singapore providing a connection to startups in India that have reached a certain point of growth where they would like to, or they're ready to look outside of India, and Singapore provides the vantage point for them to gain a certain degree of branding and recognition. They can access the Southeast Asian market, they can access the global market. We have seen examples of companies like Xiaomi, which is a Chinese mobile phone manufacturer, using Singapore as their internationalization base because they reach a certain point in China. So I think that those will be exciting opportunities. The other, I say the flip side is opportunities for companies in Singapore to innovate looking at India. And I have an example of a medical device company that's called Medtronic, the US maker for, they manufacture pacemakers. And when they set up in Singapore, one of the challenges that the business development team was asked to address is to look at why their pacemakers were not selling well in India. So they sent a team from Singapore to spend a few months in India. And they came away with two observations. One is that people who live in rural villages don't know that at risk for the heart disease. And secondly, they couldn't pay upfront for the high cost of the pacemakers. So they came back to Singapore and they innovated solutions. To address the first issue, they created remote mobile diagnostic units. So the vans could actually go to the villages, install a sensor, and they come back a day later and they take the readings and see whether indeed the possible patients are at risk. And they screened, I think, about 70,000 people, found 2,000 people at risk. They solved the second problem by structuring a consumer finance package for pacemakers. They tell us the first in the world, and they underwrite it. And so far, I think they've not had a single default, because when people have something in their hearts, they'd rather not discontinue the payments. So I think it's a good example of innovation in Singapore, but for the Indian market and expanding to the rest of Asia.
Well, I must say that one of the moments in my life which I remember the most is I took Mr. Narayan Murthy of Infosys for dinner, and he wanted a vegetarian meal, so I took him to Bombay Woodlands. And sitting next to me was the man who owned Sound Blaster.
Creative.
Yeah.
It's the same.
And he was sitting with his mother and eating a dosai. Yeah. Sam, would you complete what Casey began?
You know, I was thinking about something else. So I
yeah,
totally
go ahead.
lost track. No, I was totally lost track. Nothing to do with this. You know, I just got lost somewhere else. I believe India has a lot to offer to the world, not just to Singapore, on affordable, low-cost solutions. In a sense, coming out of Jugaad for many, many things. Take, for example, heart surgery.
Narayan Hridyalaya.
So Devi Shetty has set up a hospital in Caribbean now for the US market, 1,200 beds. You can perform quadruple bypass for $7,000. Normal quadruple bypass in US is today $100,000. I know it because I had two.
I know.
Okay. Indian one was 5,000, US one was 80,000. Same. Quality, everything is just perfect. Another area where India has a lot to offer is really traditional medicine. We have not paid attention to a lot of our traditional medicine, herbal medicinal plants. We have a foundation out of Bangalore where we have documented 9,000 herbal medicinal plants which are unique to Indian climate. Took 25 years to prepare a database and all that. I think there is a lot of wisdom in our traditional knowledge, not to fix quadruple bypass, but to do a lot of interesting things in Kerala, for example. Big on traditional medicine. I think we have forgotten a lot of that knowledge. I always give this example. My mother delivered 8 children, all at home, in a small little tribal village in Orissa. No electricity, no water, no doctor, no nurse, no pharmacy. All 8 out of 8 turned out to be mentally healthy, physically healthy. They must have done something right. We don't know what they did. Today, immediately we go to hospital because that's the Western model. Immediately it is $10,000 expense or whatever, okay? I think there is a lot of wisdom because these people have been living for thousands of years. They have done something right. Yep. So if we want to reduce cost of health delivery, we need to go back, not on everything, but on some important things to traditional health. Yep. And world has a lot to learn from it. I mean, look at our yoga. Look at meditation. It's an Indian gift to the world. Yep. There are a lot of interesting stuff going on, you know. But it's unfortunate that when we think of technology, we think of satellite, computers, you know, complicated stuff, right? So
I think that's a brilliant way to end this session. I'm very conscious that you've been most disciplined in your address in ending it on time, and so is Nandan.
thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Great privilege to be on the same panel with all three of you. You all have big reputations, and you're, you know, a big credit to your nations. Thank you very much for this privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you.